Tech is finally getting a lot of mainstream attention, and rightfully so. They're finally getting some attention primarily because of their number one transfer class as of right now, according to On3 Sports and 24/7 Sports. But when you look at this team, you say to yourselves, they're coming off an 8-5 season, third season under Joey McGuire. All three seasons under him have been bowl appearances, and the hype is pretty legit for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, their NIL collective, or which is the Matador Club, has raised a combined $11 million, not for just football, but for all sports in general. And when you have Baron Morton, who's returning for the 2025 season, he's been their starter since he was a freshman. You have Caleb Douglas, who's coming back, a transfer from Florida, who I've watched well before he came to Texas Tech, and that kid is a beast. You have Coy Eakin too, so you have your top two receivers coming back. You have three offensive line that they've recruited so far, 16 transfers all in all, and I think this, in many ways, could be the moment for them to kind of get out of that echelon of just being another team in the Big 12. Because when you look at Texas Tech historically, I think the first thing that always kind of comes to mind is hey, you're always number three behind Texas and Texas A&M, and in many ways, you almost have to embrace that, especially being at Lubbock, Texas. I mean, you have to. It's always going to be brutally competitive recruiting there, no matter what, and in many ways, those fans will hold a grudge forever. I mean, you can think about the days of the beef between Baker Mayfield and Cliff Kingsbury, and even for years after that, Texas Tech fans were still being pissed off at Baker Mayfield for essentially leaving them to be a walk-on at Oklahoma, and that story writes itself. But when you sit there and look at the Red Raiders, they have had 23 wins in the past 3 seasons, which is the best stretch that they've really had in their entire existence as a football program. You look back and you think about some of their past head coaches. You think of the legendary Mike Leach, RIP. You think of Cliff Kingsbury. You think of Matt Wells. And overall, they've kind of always had that echelon of being not a terrible team, but not a great team. They're usually somewhere in between that 5 to 8 win plateau. And the question has always been for Texas Tech, can they get over that hump? And in many ways, the issues that they have are fairly obvious. Let's just call for what it is. They absolutely play zero defense whatsoever, and the stats support that. I was watching the Liberty Bowl with them versus Arkansas, and needless to say, Arkansas looked like they had the best offense in the country. The way that Texas Tech defense was playing, they just gave up so many explosive pass plays, at least 2 or 3 touchdowns, well over 70 yards. They game 36-29 in the Liberty Bowl. But you sit there and say to yourself, okay, statistically speaking, they're fourth in offense with 37.6 points. And defensively, they're giving up 34.8 points, which is 122nd out of 134 FBS teams in the country. So in many ways, those things are kind of all fairly obvious. And you can even look back at Texas Tech for the past decade, and that narrative has been generally similar in the sense of a lot of their games are kind of shootout, shotgun games where they could be putting up as high as 30, 40, sometimes even 50-something points. I mean, they did that versus West Virginia. They did that versus Oklahoma State, which, I mean, that's sort of crazy that Oklahoma State even put up 48 on them. But at the same time, it's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, if they want to be a legitimate contender in the Big 12, you just have to be a little bit more well-balanced than what they are right now. Because the reality is that shootout football doesn't work when you're playing elite teams. It works in the situation that they're in right now, in the sense of, hey, I've said this before, and even I've said this with David Talks Buff, big shout out to him, that the Big 12 is one of the funnest conferences in all of college football to watch, in the sense of it's the Wild Wild West. You don't really ever know who's going to be at the head of the table. I mean, we went into the season. I said to myself at the beginning of the season, I thought we'd be talking about Oklahoma State or the Utah Utes, and for it to be, Colorado up top. You had Kansas State up there, and you had Arizona State, who was ranked last by essentially everybody, including myself. That's just one of the examples of what makes the Big 12 so much fun. But if you're Texas Tech, in many ways, you know what the issues are. You know that you have to round up enough funds to be able to compete with the big dogs of Texas. And when you have 11, 12 other schools in the same state going after the same recruits as you are, not to mention you have schools from Arizona and Oklahoma and Arkansas all trying to go after all these recruits. There's only so many football players to go around, especially when you're Texas Tech at this point. You're going after 4, possibly even 5-star recruits, and you're at the point now where you say to yourself, they're adding some legitimate pieces. The first piece that came up to mind for me was Quinn Joyner, who was a running back at USC, and I think is going to be an immediate asset for this team, especially if you ask yourself if there's any way that you can get less pressure off Morton, because as soon as Will Hammond had to be in the game for a little bit, the offense definitely looked a little bit different too. And it definitely would have been nice if they had a legit number one running back who at times can put a little bit less pressure on them. I mean, obviously their bread and butter, their identity is going to be an air raid offense where they're spreading out the field. They're going to test those corners and they're going to go for the big explosive plays. I'm not saying that's what should change, because I think that's exactly what they should be doing. However, when you sit there and say to yourself for so many years that your offensive line has essentially been a complete liability, your defensive line essentially gets no penetration whatsoever, and you're asking your corners to be able to just be on the field the entire game, there's only so much that you can do in that regard. And we can even and again, this is not anything new. This is historical context I'm talking about. We can even go back to the Cliff Kingsbury era and talk about him, when it was him and Patrick Mahomes doing their thing. So it's not anything different. And again, when you're overshadowed by the Longhorns and the Aggies for so long, you kind of ask yourself, where's the funding going to be coming from? But fortunately, this Matador Club has really been coming together. And the one thing that I really admire about Joey McGuire is anytime I've seen him in a press conference, he has a charisma to him and he has an infectious energy to him that I think would translates really well in terms of recruiting and in terms of convincing a lot of these guys who maybe be playing at a smaller program right now or possibly at a bigger program, and somebody who's possibly wanting to take the next step. Texas Tech seems like the perfect place for that because they have the funds in place. They don't screw around making deals. They see a guy that they want, they tell him to visit campus, and boom, within a couple hours, they have a deal going. That's what that was the New York Times post with Sam Khan Jr. back about approximately a month ago. That's what they were talking about in terms of getting shit done, especially in this day and age of college football, where essentially the transfer portal is free agency. You have to know it's pay to play. I mean, to some degree, it's always going to be like that. But in order to really get yourself in that next step, in that next level, you have to have a streamlined process where that is happening so effortlessly and flawlessly. And not to mention too, you've won your first 8-win season since 2009, so you kind of always know what the expectations are. They have not won a conference title at all of this century, but it also helps too that Jerry McGuire is 23-16 in his 3 seasons. It does help that they play at Jerry World to some degree. I know people will criticize that to some extent of, it's another college team playing NFL stadium. But at the same time, it's bringing eyes to the product, right? That's really what the big that's what really the big purpose is. I mean, that stadium, I think, fills approximately 60,000 fans. And imagine if you can sell that out. Imagine if you can sell out 60,000 fans and they're winning 8, 9, 10 games a season in the Big 12. That's, quite frankly, realistic to do if they can really even just put a semi-competent defense out there with a defensive line who can get to the quarterback every once in a while, and an offensive line who isn't giving up sack after sack after sack because, Byron Morton is an excellent quarterback. He does have a really strong arm. He is a lot more athletic than people give him credit for. And for the most part, too, he knows how to make his team looks good, and he understands what Texas Tech vision is. And as long as they stay true to that vision, they keep up this pace in the transfer portal, number one in the country right now. And right now, they're at the point where they can really be doing something special here. But again, it's all the historical nuances that you sit there and say to yourself, is this just another example of them doing what they essentially always do, which is win 6, 7 games and be content with that? Or can this be the season where you say to yourself, hey, the Matador Club is coming in clutch. You have your starting quarterback coming back. You have Caleb Delgos coming back, who had 800 yards receiving this year, and you're adding some legitimate pieces on the offense and defensive line. I think there's a lot of reason to think to yourself that this Texas Tech team could be a little bit different compared to seasons past.